Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates dreamed of prom dresses and college parties, she spent her weekends hiking through rough terrain and learning survival skills from her grandfather, a former Marine. At 19, she made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She enlisted in the Army. Her grandfather smiled when she told him. He had seen something in her that others missed. Sarah wasn't just tough on the outside. She had an inner strength that could carry her through anything. But even he couldn't have predicted what lay ahead for his granddaughter. Basic training was brutal, but Sarah thrived. While other recruits struggled with the physical demands, she pushed harder. When drill sergeants screamed in her face, she stayed calm. When others quit during difficult exercises, she kept going. Her instructors noticed something special about this young woman from Texas. After completing basic training with top honors, Sarah was selected for advanced infantry training. This was rare for women at that time, but her performance had been impossible to ignore. She excelled in every area: marksmanship, tactical planning, physical fitness, and, most importantly, mental toughness. During her second year of service, Sarah caught the attention of a special operations recruiter. He had been watching her performance for months. Her test scores were exceptional, but what really impressed him was her ability to stay focused under extreme pressure. He approached her with an opportunity that would change her life forever. "Have you ever heard of Delta Force?" he asked during a private meeting. Sarah had heard whispers about the elite Special Operations Unit. Delta Force was the military's most secretive and highly trained group. They handled missions that were too dangerous or sensitive for regular forces. Getting selected for Delta Force training was like winning the lottery, except the odds were much worse. "We think you might have what it takes," the recruiter continued. "But I have to warn you, the training will be unlike anything you've ever experienced. Most people who attempt it don't make it through the first week." Sarah didn't hesitate. She had always pushed herself to be better, to go further than anyone expected. This was her chance to prove that she belonged among the military's elite. She accepted the invitation immediately. The selection process began 3 months later at a classified location in the mountains of North Carolina. Sarah arrived with 47 other candidates, all of them experienced soldiers who had already proven themselves in combat. She was one of only 3 women in the group, and she could feel the skeptical stares from some of the men. The first test was designed to break people mentally before the physical challenges even began. Candidates were given impossible tasks with constantly changing rules. Instructors would scream contradictory orders, then punish everyone for following them. The psychological pressure was intense, designed to find people who could think clearly under extreme stress. By the end of the first day, 6 candidates had quit. By the end of the first week, only 23 remained. Sarah was still there, quietly outperforming many of the men who had initially doubted her abilities. The physical training was beyond anything she had experienced before. 20-mile runs with full combat gear through mountain terrain. Hand-to-hand combat training that left everyone bloody and bruised. Climbing walls and obstacles that seemed impossible to complete. Swimming through freezing cold rivers while carrying heavy equipment. But it was the survival training that truly tested their limits. Candidates were dropped into remote wilderness areas with minimal supplies and told to survive for days while avoiding capture by hunting teams. They had to find food, water, and shelter while constantly moving to avoid being caught. Sarah discovered she had a natural talent for survival situations. Her childhood camping trips with her grandfather had given her skills that many of her fellow candidates lacked. She knew how to read the landscape, find water sources, and stay hidden. While others struggled to adapt, she seemed to thrive in the wilderness. The instructors began to take special notice of her performance. They had trained thousands of elite soldiers over the years, but Sarah was different. She had a combination of physical strength, mental toughness, and survival instincts that was extremely rare. They decided to give her additional challenges to see how far she could be pushed. During one exercise, she was separated from her team and told to reach an extraction point 50 miles away through hostile territory. She had to avoid multiple hunting teams, cross dangerous terrain, and do it all within a specific time limit. Most candidates would have been captured or failed to reach the target in time. Sarah not only reached the extraction point ahead of schedule, but she had also gathered intelligence on enemy positions along the way. Her instructors were impressed, but not entirely surprised. They had been watching her adapt and overcome every challenge thrown at her. As the weeks passed, more candidates dropped out or were eliminated. The training became increasingly difficult and dangerous. Live ammunition exercises, where one mistake could be fatal. Interrogation resistance training that pushed people to their psychological breaking points. Medical training where they had to perform surgery on animals to learn life-saving techniques. Through it all, Sarah persevered. She learned to compartmentalize fear and pain, to function at peak performance even when her body and mind were exhausted. She mastered advanced weapons systems, explosives, and communication equipment. She learned languages, studied foreign cultures, and practiced blending into different environments. The final phase of training was the most challenging yet. Candidates were taken to a desert training facility in Nevada where they would face their ultimate test. The desert was unforgiving, scorching hot during the day, freezing cold at night. Water was scarce, and the terrain was treacherous. Sarah stood with the 8 remaining candidates as their instructor explained the final exercise. They would be split into 2 teams and given a complex mission to complete. The scenario involved rescuing hostages from a terrorist camp while avoiding capture by enemy forces. What the candidates didn't know was that this exercise would push them beyond their training. The instructors had planned something that would test not just their military skills, but their very will to survive. For Sarah, this final test would become the most important challenge of her life. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, Sarah checked her equipment one final time. She had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, her fellow trainees would abandon her in the most hostile environment imaginable. But all those years of training, all those lessons from her grandfather, and all those moments when she had pushed herself beyond her limits had been preparing her for what was coming. The desert would try to kill her, but Sarah Martinez was about to prove that Delta Force training creates more than just soldiers. It creates survivors who never give up, no matter how impossible the odds become. The mission briefing was straightforward, or so it seemed. 2 teams of 4 would infiltrate separate sectors of a simulated terrorist compound. Team Alpha, led by Marcus Thompson, a veteran with 12 years of combat experience, would handle the primary target building. Team Bravo, with Sarah as the communications specialist, would secure the perimeter and provide backup support. Sarah's team consisted of herself, Jake Rodriguez, David Chun, and team leader Lieutenant Brian Foster. All 3 men had initially been skeptical about working with a woman in such an elite unit, but Sarah's performance during training had earned their grudging respect. They knew she was capable, even if some of them still harbored doubts about women in special operations. The exercise began at 0200 hours under a moonless sky. The desert air was cold, a sharp contrast to the blazing heat they would face once the sun rose. Both teams moved silently through the rocky terrain, their night vision equipment turning the landscape into an eerie green-tinted world. Sarah carried the team's advanced communication equipment, a 40-pound pack filled with radios, satellite links, and electronic warfare devices. Her job was to maintain contact with headquarters and coordinate between the 2 teams during the operation. It was a critical role that required both technical expertise and the ability to stay calm under pressure. For the first 3 hours, everything went according to plan. Both teams reached their staging areas without being detected by the opposing force instructors who were playing the role of enemy guards. Sarah established communication with headquarters and began monitoring enemy radio frequencies, gathering intelligence that would help both teams complete their mission. But as dawn approached, something began to change in the dynamics of her team. During training, the pressure and competition had created tension between some of the candidates. Not everyone was comfortable with the idea of a woman potentially earning a spot in Delta Force. Some of the old-school soldiers believed that special operations should remain an all-male domain. Lieutenant Foster had been one of Sarah's harshest critics during training, though he had kept his opinions mostly to himself. He believed that standards were being lowered to accommodate women, even though Sarah had met or exceeded every requirement. The stress of the final exercise began to amplify these underlying tensions. As the teams prepared for the main assault, Foster made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He had been looking for a way to prove that women couldn't handle the real pressures of special operations. The isolated desert location gave him an opportunity he hadn't expected. Martinez, Foster called softly over the radio. "We need you to establish a communication relay on that ridge about 2 miles south of here. Take the equipment and set up an observation post. We'll continue with the mission and pick you up after the objective is complete." Sarah knew something wasn't right about the order. Standard procedure called for the team to stay together unless absolutely necessary. But Foster was her team leader, and following orders was ingrained in every aspect of her training. She gathered her equipment and began the trek toward the designated ridge. The terrain was treacherous in the darkness. Loose rocks and hidden crevices made every step dangerous. Sarah moved carefully, using her night vision to navigate through the hostile landscape. It took her nearly an hour to reach the position Foster had designated. As she set up the communication equipment, Sarah tried to raise her team on the radio. Static filled her headset. She adjusted frequencies and checked connections, but couldn't establish contact. That should have been her first warning that something was seriously wrong. While Sarah worked to establish communications, her team was completing their part of the exercise. But instead of returning to pick her up as promised, Foster led his men toward the extraction point without her. When Jake Rodriguez questioned the decision, Foster claimed they had received orders to evacuate immediately due to a training emergency. "What about Martinez?" Jake asked, clearly uncomfortable with abandoning a team member. "She's been picked up by Team Alpha," Foster lied smoothly. "Emergency extraction. We need to move now." The other team members accepted this explanation, though Jake continued to feel uneasy about the situation. They made their way to the extraction point, where helicopters waited to transport them back to base. As they flew away from the desert, Sarah was still trying to establish radio contact, unaware that she had been deliberately abandoned. By sunrise, Sarah realized she was in serious trouble. Her team hadn't returned, and she couldn't reach anyone on the radio. The communication equipment that was supposed to connect her to the outside world seemed to be malfunctioning. What she didn't know was that Foster had sabotaged key components before sending her away from the group. The temperature began to climb rapidly as the sun rose higher in the desert sky. Sarah made the decision to stay at her current position and continue trying to establish contact. She rationed her water carefully, knowing that dehydration would become her biggest enemy if rescue was delayed. Hours passed with no contact from her team or headquarters. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and the temperature soared past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah's uniform was soaked with sweat, and she could feel her body beginning to struggle with the heat. By midday, she made the difficult decision to abandon her position and try to reach the original extraction point. She had studied maps of the area during mission planning, but navigating in the desert was far more challenging than it appeared on paper. Landmarks that seemed distinct on the map looked similar in the harsh reality of the desert landscape. Sarah began walking, carrying her water supply and essential equipment. She moved slowly to conserve energy, stopping frequently in whatever shade she could find. The weight of her gear made every step more difficult, but she knew that abandoning critical equipment could be a fatal mistake. As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah realized she was lost. The ridge lines and rock formations all looked the same, and she had become disoriented trying to navigate around impassable terrain. She had been walking for hours, using precious water and energy, and was no closer to safety than when she had started. That night, as the temperature dropped and the desert became bitterly cold, Sarah huddled in a small cave she had found in a rocky outcropping. She allowed herself small sips of water and tried to think through her situation logically. Something had gone wrong with the exercise, but she couldn't figure out what had happened to her team. She couldn't know that back at the base, Foster was filing a report claiming that Sarah had become disoriented during the exercise and wandered away from her assigned position. He suggested that she had suffered a psychological breakdown under pressure and recommended that the search and rescue operation be delayed until morning. The base commander was skeptical of Foster's story, but without communication from Sarah, he had no way to verify what had actually happened. He ordered a search to begin at first light, but the vast desert would make finding one person extremely difficult. Meanwhile, Jake Rodriguez couldn't shake his feeling that something was wrong. He approached other members of the training cadre and expressed his concerns about leaving Sarah behind. His questions led to a more detailed investigation of Foster's actions during the exercise. As Sarah spent her first full night alone in the desert, she had no idea that her survival had become more than just a training exercise. Foster's actions had turned her final test into a real life-or-death situation. She was miles from the nearest road, with limited water and no way to call for help. But Sarah Martinez hadn't made it through months of grueling training by giving up when things got difficult. As she lay in the cold desert cave, she began planning her survival strategy. She would use every skill she had learned, every lesson from her grandfather, and every ounce of determination she possessed. The desert had claimed many lives over the years, but Sarah was about to prove that Delta Force training creates people who simply refuse to die. Her real test was just beginning, and failure wasn't an option she was willing to consider. Dawn brought no relief from Sarah's desperate situation. The rising sun painted the desert landscape in brilliant oranges and reds, but the beauty was lost on her as she faced the harsh reality of her predicament. She had spent the night shivering in the small cave, rationing her water down to tiny sips that barely wet her lips. Sarah's military training kicked in as she assessed her resources. She had one full canteen of water, about half a canteen that remained, 2 energy bars, a knife, her communications equipment that wasn't working, and the clothes on her back. In the unforgiving Nevada desert, these supplies might last her 2 days if she was careful, maybe 3 if she was lucky. But Sarah wasn't planning to rely on luck. Her grandfather had taught her that survival wasn't about what you had, but about what you knew and how you used your knowledge. She began implementing lessons she had learned during countless camping trips and survival training exercises. The first priority was finding water. Sarah knew that desert survival depended entirely on staying hydrated. She studied the landscape around her cave, looking for signs that might indicate underground water sources. In the distance, she noticed a line of slightly greener vegetation following what appeared to be a dry creek bed. Moving during the day would be dangerous due to the extreme heat, but Sarah couldn't afford to wait. She needed to find water before her current supply ran out. She wrapped her shirt around her head for protection from the sun and began making her way toward the creek bed. The terrain was brutal. Loose rocks shifted under her feet with every step, threatening to twist an ankle or cause a fall. Thorny desert plants tore at her clothing and skin. The sun beat down mercilessly, and within an hour of walking, her uniform was completely soaked with sweat. When she reached the dry creek bed, Sarah began digging in areas where the sand seemed slightly darker or where she could see traces of mineral deposits. Her grandfather had taught her that even dry creek beds often had water flowing underneath the surface. Using her knife and bare hands, she dug several holes, going deeper each time. On her 4th attempt, nearly 3 feet down, her fingers touched dampness. Sarah's heart raced with excitement as she continued digging until muddy water began seeping into the hole. It wasn't clean, and it certainly wasn't safe to drink without purification, but it was water. Sarah used techniques she had learned in survival training to filter and purify the water. She removed her undershirt and used it as a crude filter, straining the water through the fabric multiple times to remove sediment. Then, she placed the water in her canteen and left it in direct sunlight, knowing that UV rays would help kill some harmful bacteria. While the water was being purified by the sun, Sarah searched the area for anything edible. Desert survival meant eating whatever you could find, no matter how unappetizing it might seem. She found several types of cactus that she knew were safe to eat, carefully removing the spines and thorns. The prickly pear cactus provided both food and moisture. Sarah used her knife to carefully peel away the outer skin, revealing the fleshy interior. It tasted terrible, but it contained precious water and nutrients that her body desperately needed. She also found some edible seeds and roots that would provide additional sustenance. As the afternoon heat became unbearable, Sarah returned to her cave to wait for evening. She had managed to collect almost a full canteen of muddy but drinkable water, and she had gathered enough plant material to supplement her energy bars. It wasn't much, but it bought her more time. During the hottest part of the day, when moving outside would have been suicidal, Sarah used the time to plan her next moves. She studied the landscape visible from her cave, trying to identify landmarks and determine which direction offered the best chance of reaching safety. Sarah remembered from the mission briefing that there was a road approximately 15 miles to the east of their original position. The problem was that she had become disoriented during her movements and wasn't sure which direction was actually east. Without a working compass or GPS, she would have to rely on natural navigation techniques. That evening, as the temperature began to drop, Sarah prepared to move. She had decided that staying in one place and hoping for rescue was too risky. The search teams might never find her small cave, and her supplies wouldn't last long enough for an extended rescue operation. Using the position of the North Star, Sarah determined her heading and began walking east through the desert night. Moving at night was safer due to the cooler temperatures, but it also presented new dangers. In the darkness, it was easy to step into holes, trip over rocks, or walk off cliffs. Sarah moved slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to check her direction and look for hazards. She had learned during training that getting injured while alone in a hostile environment was usually a death sentence. One twisted ankle or broken bone could end any chance of survival. Throughout the night, Sarah maintained a steady pace, covering approximately 8 miles before the approaching dawn forced her to find shelter again. She discovered an overhang formed by eroded rock that provided protection from the sun and wind. It wasn't as good as her previous cave, but it would have to do. Her second day in the desert was even more challenging than the first. The physical exertion of the night march had depleted her energy, and she was beginning to feel the effects of dehydration despite her careful water management. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue felt swollen, and she was experiencing the early signs of heat exhaustion. But Sarah's mental training proved to be just as important as her physical preparation. She had learned to compartmentalize discomfort and pain, focusing on the tasks necessary for survival rather than dwelling on her suffering. Every time doubt crept into her thoughts, she reminded herself of her grandfather's words, "The mind gives up before the body does. Control your mind, and your body will follow." During her rest period, Sarah noticed that her communications equipment was picking up faint signals. The higher elevation of her current position seemed to be improving reception. She spent hours adjusting frequencies and antenna positions, trying to establish contact with anyone who might be listening. Her persistence finally paid off when she managed to pick up radio chatter from a commercial aircraft passing overhead. She couldn't communicate with them directly, but hearing human voices gave her hope that she was moving in the right direction toward more populated areas. Sarah also discovered that the slightly cooler temperatures at this elevation allowed her to be more active during daylight hours. She used this advantage to search for additional water sources and edible plants. The desert that had seemed completely barren from a distance actually contained numerous resources for someone who knew where to look. She found barrel cacti that contained significant amounts of water, though extracting it required careful technique to avoid the dangerous spines. She also discovered a small colony of ants, which provided protein despite their unpleasant taste. Every calorie and every drop of moisture brought her closer to survival. As her second night in the desert approached, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic about her chances. She had successfully found water, food, and shelter. Her navigation seemed to be on track, and she was making steady progress toward what she hoped was safety. But the desert wasn't finished testing her yet. During the night, a sudden sandstorm struck with little warning. Winds exceeding 50 miles per hour turned the air into a stinging wall of sand and grit that made it impossible to see or breathe normally. Sarah was forced to take shelter behind a large boulder, covering her face with her shirt and trying to protect her eyes and lungs from the abrasive sand. The storm lasted for hours, during which she couldn't move or make any progress toward safety. When the storm finally passed, Sarah emerged to find that her carefully planned route had been obscured by shifting sand dunes. Landmarks she had been using for navigation were either buried or completely changed. Once again, she was lost in an environment that seemed determined to kill her. But Sarah Martinez had not come this far to give up now. She had proven to herself that she could find water, food, and shelter in one of the world's most hostile environments. The desert had thrown everything it could at her: extreme heat, bitter cold, dehydration, sandstorms, and complete isolation. Yet she was still alive, still fighting, still moving towards safety. Her Delta Force training was being tested in ways her instructors had never intended, and she was passing every test the desert could devise. Now she just had to prove she could find her way home. After the sandstorm, Sarah faced her darkest moment yet. The landscape had been completely transformed, with new sand dunes covering familiar landmarks and erasing any trace of the path she had been following. For the first time since being abandoned, she felt the crushing weight of genuine despair threatening to overwhelm her determination. She sat in the pre-dawn darkness, her back against a wind-carved rock, and allowed herself 5 minutes of complete honesty about her situation. She was lost, running dangerously low on water, and had been surviving on cactus flesh and insects for 3 days. Her body was beginning to shut down from dehydration, and her mental clarity was starting to fade. But even in that moment of brutal self-assessment, Sarah found reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. When everything seems hopeless, that's when you find out what you're really made of. She had always thought she understood what he meant, but only now, facing death in the Nevada desert, did she truly grasp the depth of those words. Sarah forced herself to stand and continue moving. She chose to follow the path of the sandstorm, reasoning that it had blown from west to east and might lead her toward the roads and civilization she was desperately seeking. It was a calculated gamble based on her understanding of regional weather patterns, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. As she walked through the fourth night, Sarah began experiencing hallucinations caused by severe dehydration. She saw lights in the distance that weren't there, heard voices calling her name, and sometimes forgot where she was entirely. But her training helped her recognize these symptoms and maintain enough rational thought to keep moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, back at the training base, the investigation into Sarah's disappearance had intensified dramatically. Jake Rodriguez had refused to accept Lieutenant Foster's story about Sarah being picked up by another team. His persistent questions had led to a formal inquiry that quickly uncovered the truth about what had happened during the exercise. When confronted with evidence of his deception, Foster initially tried to maintain his story. But, under intense questioning from base investigators, other team members began revealing details that contradicted his account. David Chin admitted that they had never received orders for an emergency extraction, and that Foster had specifically told them not to mention Sarah's absence to anyone. The base commander, Colonel James Harrison, was furious when he learned the full scope of Foster's actions. Not only had a soldier been deliberately abandoned in a hostile environment, but the cover-up had delayed search and rescue operations for crucial hours. He immediately ordered every available aircraft and ground team to begin searching for Sarah. But finding one person in thousands of square miles of desert terrain was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Search helicopters flew grid patterns over the most likely areas, while ground teams checked every cave, overhang, and possible shelter. After 2 days of intensive searching, they had found no trace of Sarah or any sign that she was still alive. Colonel Harrison faced a terrible decision. Military protocol dictated that after a certain amount of time without contact, a missing person should be presumed dead. The desert was unforgiving, and surviving for more than 3 days without proper supplies was considered nearly impossible by survival experts. However, Harrison had reviewed Sarah's training records and knew she was exceptional. If anyone could survive in such conditions, it would be someone with her combination of skills and determination. He made the decision to continue the search operation for another 24 hours, despite pressure from his superiors to call it off. On the morning of the 5th day, Sarah was barely conscious as she stumbled across the desert floor. Her water had run out 12 hours earlier, and her body was shutting down from severe dehydration. She could no longer walk in a straight line, and she frequently fell to her knees, struggling to find the strength to stand again. But she kept moving, driven by a will that refused to surrender even when her body was failing. She had covered nearly 30 miles since being abandoned, navigating by instinct and determination when rational thought became impossible. It was search and rescue pilot Captain Mike Stevens who finally spotted her. Flying his helicopter in an expanded search grid that extended beyond the normal parameters, he caught a glimpse of movement near a dry lake bed. Through his binoculars, he saw what appeared to be a person stumbling across the open ground. "This is Rescue 7. Stevens radioed to the command post. I have possible visual contact with our missing soldier. Coordinates 36.2847 north, 115.1234 west. Moving to investigate." As the helicopter descended, Stevens could see that the figure below was indeed wearing military fatigues. The person appeared to be in severe distress, stumbling and falling repeatedly. Stevens landed his aircraft 50 yards away and ran toward the collapsed figure. Sarah was barely conscious when Stevens reached her. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin was burned and dehydrated, and she was mumbling incoherently. But when Stevens identified himself as military rescue, Sarah managed to focus her eyes on him and whisper, "Martinez, Sarah, Special Operations Candidate." The helicopter rushed Sarah to the nearest military hospital, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize her condition. She was suffering from severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, malnutrition, and numerous cuts and bruises from her ordeal. Her core body temperature was dangerously elevated, and her kidneys were beginning to fail from lack of water. For the first 24 hours, doctors weren't sure if Sarah would survive. Her body had been pushed far beyond normal human limits, and the damage from 5 days in the desert was extensive. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting to recover from the trauma it had endured. But slowly, as fluids and nutrients were restored to her system, Sarah began to recover. Her first clear memory was waking up to see Colonel Harrison sitting beside her hospital bed. His expression was a mixture of relief, admiration, and barely controlled anger about what had happened to her. "How are you feeling, soldier?" Harrison asked quietly. "Ready to get back to training, sir," Sarah replied, her voice still weak but determined. Harrison shook his head in amazement. After surviving an ordeal that would have killed most people, Sarah's first thought was completing her mission. "I think you've proven everything you need to prove," he told her. "The question now is whether Delta Force is worthy of having you." The investigation into Lieutenant Foster's actions resulted in a court-martial and his immediate dismissal from the military. His deliberate abandonment of a team member was considered one of the most serious breaches of military conduct possible. Jake Rodriguez and David Chun received reprimands for not questioning orders more thoroughly, but their cooperation with the investigation prevented more serious consequences. Sarah spent 2 weeks recovering in the hospital before being cleared to return to duty. When she arrived back at the training facility, she discovered that word of her survival had spread throughout the special operations community. Instructors who had trained thousands of elite soldiers were amazed by what she had accomplished. The final phase of Delta Force selection was waived for Sarah. Her 5 days alone in the desert had demonstrated survival skills, mental toughness, and determination that went far beyond anything that could be tested in a training exercise. She had proven that she possessed the most important quality of an elite soldier, the absolute refusal to give up, no matter how hopeless the situation appeared. Colonel Harrison personally presented Sarah with her Delta Force qualification. "Most of our training is designed to simulate extreme situations," he told her. "But you survived an actual extreme situation that was far worse than anything we could create in training. You've proven that Delta Force training works, and, more importantly, you've proven that you embody everything this unit represents." Sarah's survival story became legendary within military special operations circles. She had demonstrated that elite training, combined with unbreakable determination, could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Her experience also led to significant improvements in safety protocols and oversight of training exercises to prevent similar incidents in the future. Years later, when asked about her time in the desert, Sarah would say that those 5 days taught her the most important lesson of her military career. "I learned that survival isn't about the equipment you carry or the training you receive," she explained. "It's about the decision to never stop fighting, even when everything seems hopeless." Sarah Martinez had entered the desert as a special operations candidate. She emerged as a proven warrior who had faced death and refused to surrender. The desert had tested her in ways that no training exercise ever could, and she had passed that test with a strength that amazed everyone who knew her story. Delta Force had found not just a new member, but someone who truly understood what it meant to never leave a fallen comrade behind, because she had experienced firsthand what it felt like to be abandoned and had survived through sheer determination and the will to live.